Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another What If video. Today's topic is, what if an employee is incompetent? How can an employer dismiss an employee for incapacity due to poor performance? Now, just by way of introduction, one of the recognized reasons to fairly terminate the services of an employee is his or her incapacity due to poor work performance. Now, in today's video, I will be examining the requirements for dealing with employees who after completing their probationary period successfully, fail to meet the required standards of performance. Now, the Code of Good Practice on Dismissal requires that the fairness of the dismissal of a poor performer must be judged in terms of the following. Number one, was there a performance standard in place? Now, this suggests that all jobs need to have standards of performance set for them. Number two, was the standard known to the employee? Number three, did the employee fail to meet the standard? Number four, did the employer establish the reasons for the underperformance? Number five, has the employee been given appropriate evaluation, instruction, guidance, training, or counseling? Number five, has the employee been given a reasonable period of time of improvement? Number six, were there suitable alternatives to dismissal, for example, demotion? And if not, then dismissal will be fair. Now, there are 6 points that I want to discuss, and they are the following. Number one, the evaluating of the poor performer. So how do we evaluate the poor performer? Number two, how do we instruct the poor performer? Number three, how do we train the poor performer? How do we guide the poor performer? How do we counsel the poor performer? And then probably most importantly, if there's underperformance, what process do we need to follow before we can terminate or dismiss the employee? Now, let's start with number one, evaluating the poor performer. Now, performance is evaluated or assessed by examining the employee's actual performance against the known or agreed job standards. Now, the need to evaluate the employee's performance is a critical step when dealing with poor performance, in that it clarifies the exact nature of the problem. So, in other words, what must be achieved and what is actually being achieved by the employee. Unless the employee is made aware of the specific performance problem, it would in most cases be unreasonable to expect the employee to take steps to resolve it, or it would be unreasonable to dismiss the employee for something which he or she may be unaware of. In terms of point number two, instructing the poor performer. Now, whilst it is not clear from the code what is meant by appropriate instruction, it is reasonable to assume that this involves ensuring that the employee is or has been told what the important basics are of how the job should be performed and the various rules, regulations, and perhaps policies which must be adhered to. If the employee is performing poorly because of a lack of basic information about the job or how the job should be carried out or the rules and regulations which must be adhered to while at work, then it would be unfair to penalize the employee. Management has a responsibility to ensure that all employees, and especially those performing below standards, are provided with the key information they require to perform their work correctly. In terms of training the poor performer, point number three, the employee needs to be provided with the specific knowledge or skills which he or she needs to be able to perform the work to the required standard. How much training, if any, and what type of training should be provided to the poor performer will depend on a number of factors. For example, if the employee's job content has changed or has been changed, then detailed and comprehensive training may be appropriate to assist the employee to carry out the new or changed tasks. However, if the employee's previous performance has been up to standard and there have been no job changes or no changes in terms of their job, then training may not be appropriate in such a case. Costs may also be an issue when deciding whether training is appropriate. For example, on-the-job training may be affordable and appropriate in most circumstances, but sending the employee on an external program may not be. Lastly, we need to also look at the nature of the job, because the nature of the job itself may have an effect on whether it is appropriate to provide training. For example, at a very senior level, where it is reasonably expected that the employee already possesses the required skill, or where there are important deadlines to meet and training would take longer than the time available. In those examples, training may not be viable or a viable option. In terms of point number 4, how do we guide the poor performer? This implies showing the employee the right way to do things, on-the-job coaching, and generally helping the employee to avoid the pitfalls of doing things or doing their work incorrectly. It may also include spending time with a poor performer in order to guide them to improve their performance to the required standard. The next point is counseling the poor performer. And in our view, this is perhaps the most important requirement of all for dealing fairly with poor performance. Counseling is a process whereby the employee is told that their performance is below standard. The causes of the poor performance are investigated together with the employee. The employee is assisted as may be appropriate to improve to the required level, and when necessary, the employee is clearly informed that the failure to meet the required standard could result in the employee becoming unsuitable for continued employment. Now, most importantly is the process. It is essential to implement a correct counseling process, as the code makes it clear that poor performance should not be handled in the same way as misconduct. Poor performance is not viewed as a disciplinary offense, and the employee who performs poorly should therefore be dealt with through the counseling process rather than disciplinary procedures. This is sound practice, as the employee who is experiencing difficulties in doing the job is usually neither behaving badly nor breaking any rules, and should thus be treated in a supportive rather than a punitive way. Now, the following is a suggested process to follow. Please note that a shortened process may be sufficient depending on the circumstances, for example, the seniority of the employee. Step 1 of the process, ladies and gentlemen, is to hold a first counseling meeting at which the employee is informed of the specific details of the substandard performance, and the employee is asked to give any reasons as to why it is happening. In this meeting, the employee is asked how it can be improved to the required standard, and the employee is given guidance on how to improve. In the same meeting, the employee is informed as to what other assistance by way of training or instruction will be provided to the employee, as well as how and when progress will be monitored. And then finally, in the same meeting, the employee is given a date on which the performance problem area will be reviewed. That is step 1. Step 2 is a follow-up counseling meeting, and that should be held if the performance does not improve. If the performance or the standard had been achieved by the employee should be praised, and the employee should be asked to keep up the improvement. We should also indicate to the employee that a relapse will result in the process continuing where it left off. Step number 3 is where the standard has not been reached. Then we need to discuss further with the employee what needs to be done and by when. The employee should be informed that unless his or her performance improves to the required level, he or she may become unsuitable for continued employment. Step 4. In the latter case, in other words, where the employee's performance continues to be substandard or subpar, we need to schedule a third counseling meeting at which the performance is reviewed again. If it is to the required standard, then the counseling ends and the employee is again informed that should there be a relapse, we will continue with the process where we left off. If the standard has not been reached, consider whether further time can be allowed for improvement. If so, schedule a further follow-up meeting. If no further time can reasonably be allowed, indicate to the employee that an incapacity hearing will be held and that notice thereof will be given in writing. Now, at the incapacity hearing, the employee must be obviously given reasonable notice thereof, and the usual rights will apply. For example, the right to be represented by a fellow employee. If you are the line manager responsible for managing the problem, you are required or responsible for submitting evidence in the hearing to satisfy the requirements of items 8 and 9 of the code that I have discussed above. The chairperson must also judge the matter in light of those requirements. And before deciding to dismiss, the chairperson should consider ways short of dismissal to remedy the problem. For example, a transfer or demotion to an appropriate position with or without a lowering in status and benefits. Remember, dismissal must always be the last resort. Please note also that there is no limit as to how many or how few counseling meetings must be held. The number will be determined by the need to ensure that the employee has been given every appropriate assistance to improve and reasonable time to do so. Factors such as the employee's seniority, the seriousness of the problem, as well as the effect of the problem on the organization will play a role. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, the code clarifies the requirements to effect a fair dismissal for poor performance. However, it also places the onus on management to follow a fair process before doing so and to prove the fact of the underperformance, if required to do so. If this is not done, the CCMA may well decide to award reinstatement or costly financial compensation to the employee. Now that then brings us to the end of this video. As always, thank you for watching, and should you require any assistance in specifically with regards to poor performance of your employees, please do not hesitate to contact us. Until next time, bye-bye.